Hello.
Hi, Samir. Welcome to the third Metabolic Health Conference. I'll quickly run through the intro so that we can, deep dive into your very intriguing perspective of food addiction and, your work that has been so far, that you've done so far. So I'm Ira Sahai, the Chief Operating Officer of D-Life Healthcare Private Limited, a very proud D-Life certified metabolic health coach and the lead host of the third Metabolic Health Conference organized from India by Shashi and Anup. D-Life's India first and the only award-winning low-carb platform that was founded in 2014 by Anup Singh, a silver medalist from India's Ivy League institution, IIT Roorkee. Anup is also the recipient of the Icons of India Award. He pioneered the low-carb movement in India in 2012 with his path-breaking protocol of 100-gram carbs per day max. That's now being widely used and quoted everywhere. And yesterday we had two sessions from global stalwarts who congratulated Anup and they were intrigued on how we were using 100-gram carbs on a vegetarian diet. So that's about me and D-Life and the event. And Samir, who is here, who's our guest today. Samir is a heart health coach dedicating to reversing metabolic diseases through diet and lifestyle intervention. He's completing a PhD in anthropology this year and is the author of the Health Dialectic. Before transitioning to health coaching, he spent 20 years in the NGO sector, advocating for economic justice on a global scale. Today, he applies his expertise in human ecology, ancestral health, and the metabolic science to help people take back control of their health and life. Samir, most welcome. And it's a pleasure to see you again. Last time we met was on your podcast. So,
Yeah,
great
yeah, that
pleasure
was a
to
great discussion, and I look forward to this discussion. Can I just say before we get started, this has been such a fascinating 3 days. I've been trying to keep up. There's so much content. There's so many great discussions you've had. I'm really super impressed with the job you guys have done. So fantastic stuff.
Yeah, thank you for watching, and I agree with you. We have one after another fantastic sessions, and global low carb stalwarts and their work, all out there for us to benefit. So let's begin. Samir, yeah, the first question that I would want to ask you is, in your work that's focused on the intersection of food addiction, capitalism and social control, you highlight how addiction is now widely recognized in scientific literature also. How do you differentiate between true food addiction and habitual eating? There's a lot of conflict there. And yesterday we had Dr. Jen Unwin who gave us the tool which is craved, CRAVED, to identify food addiction. So I would want to know this from you.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Jen said is absolutely right. I think that in terms of the literature, so for me as a researcher, these things don't necessarily have clear definitions right now. But when you're living it, you sort of know it, right? So for example, if you're fixated on a certain food, so for me, it's chocolate. For the people, it may be potato chips. For the people, it may be something else. That is a sign that you may be suffering from addiction. And the real trick for me is if you force yourself to have some time away from it, what happens then? Can people notice when you're not taking your chocolate? Can people notice when you've given up? Or I used to be a smoker. People could certainly notice when I was trying to give up smoking, right? Because I would get irritable and so on, right? So there's certain things. It's more about the behavior than actually. I can't say if you're eating, 100 grams of chocolate, you're an addict, and 50 grams, you're not. There's no hard and fast definitions like that. You just have to look at the behaviors.
Yeah. Samir, you've discussed how certain ultra processed foods are designed to be highly addictive. Could you elaborate on the role of food companies, which I also think is very sinister? And I think as an expert on this, you've done a lot of work on this. Tell us how food companies engineer this addiction.
Well, I think there's two sides to it. I mean, one is the lab side. So this is a great, I'm trying to remember what the documentary is. It was on Netflix. One of those pretty big food ones. And they took the case of, basically they were giving housewives in the Delhi area some amount of money. I don't think they were particularly well paid, but maybe a few thousand rupees for coming out. And they would be in little stalls. And they would all be tasting Maggi noodles, right? And these were all things that already there had been so many concoctions made. And you could tell that the food scientists were already pretty good because the ladies would all raise their hand for the same thing. Whenever they were asked to identify what's their favorite out of 3 or out of 6 or out of 10, it would almost always be the same thing. So it means that the food scientists know their market. They have all kinds of ingredients that are tailored to that market. So when we talk about India, say something like the achar flavor, like the pickle, the kind of mango pickle that many of us grew up on, that is something that is very specific to India. And if you have a flavor to that or that kind of flavor profile, you're not going to use that for your international brand. You're only going to use that in India. So they're thinking through this. And of course, if it was your job to sell as many Maggi noodles as possible, you would be thinking through the exact same thing. So one of my points is that this is not some nefarious conspiracy, or if it is, it's just the way the system is designed. Maggi has to sell its noodles, and this is how they're doing it to compete with it, whatever their competition is, and to do it in a better way.
Mm. Okay, many in the low carb space, speak of carb addiction. Yet in your research, Sameer, you suggest that the most addictive foods contain a mix of carbs and fats. What makes this combination so powerful in driving compulsive eating or, addiction?
I mean, I think that there are two things really. So one is that almost all of those foods, not all of those foods that I would name as the most addictive foods, or many people would name as the most addictive foods, it's not just me, they're protein deficient, right? And we know from other research and indeed from discussions you guys have had over the last 3 days that protein is I think it was Marty Kendall is the one I'm thinking of. Protein is the most satiating macronutrient. So satiating is sort of the enemy of the capitalist logic here, right? Because if you're full after one bite, well, that's okay, but wouldn't it be great if you're never full? If you just keep eating and eating and eating. So they're protein deficient, so that will encourage overeating. Secondly, they do have this combination of fats and carbs, which is actually quite rare in nature. But one of the places where we do find a combination of fats and carbs is in breast milk, right? Human breast milk, I looked it up, has a fat to carb ratio of 1:2. So you have 1 part fat to 2 part carbs. That's kind of similar to the kind of ratios you see in something like pizza or donuts or some of these, like the most addictive foods on those lists, right? Milk, of course, is designed to promote rapid growth. A newborn to go from a newborn to a toddler, you have to triple the weight or sometimes quadruple the weight. So this is my thinking right now. I'm not saying this with too much confidence because I think there's a lot more research that needs to be done on this. But the fact that some of these addictive foods have low protein and mimic the fat to carb ratio of human milk, I think these are intriguing and may indicate why they're so addictive.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Sameer, you have drawn historical parallels between addiction and labor control. Now, that's a very intriguing angle, and I would like to hear more about it, particularly in South Africa mining, operations. So, could you expand on how addiction, especially to sugar and refined carbs, have been used as a tool for economic manipulation? I'm really intrigued by this angle. Please elaborate on this.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, when I'm writing about this, I'm not writing so much about the sugar and carbs because I don't know, there hasn't been enough research done on this. What does happen, and we can talk about this a little bit later too, what does happen is that those tend to be the cheaper foods. So if you think about who are in the Indian context, what are the Dalits going to be eating, Dalit people are going to be eating. In the South African context, what are the enslaved people going to be eating, or the people who've been brought as indentured servants? Largely, they're going to be eating those cheap carbs, right? So there's one aspect of this that's just economics. People don't have any money, so this is the only thing they can get their hands on. But the addiction point was really, the research is mostly done on alcohol. So I work with communities, some of your listeners some of the viewers may know, they're called Khoisan communities here in South Africa. These are some of the last remaining sort of tribal indigenous people who actually do their own hunting and so on. Some of the last of those on the planet. And many of them, since about 1948, were employed as farm workers. And I was shocked when I went to those communities and visited them and heard their stories. They weren't paid in money, Ira. They were paid in alcohol.
Oh.
They were given like a bottle of rum at the end of the week. And that was terrible for all kinds of things. You can imagine what happens. I mean, first of all, they're not getting paid in money. What are they going to do for food and all these things? They're completely dependent on their employers, number one. Number two, you can imagine what happens when a man who feels like he's been working hard all week gets a bottle of rum on a Friday night. I mean, it's not a particularly good scene for the women in the household or even for himself the next day. He's out of commission, right? He finishes it all in a night, right? So this is, and then there's the fact that he's going to want more. The addiction aspect makes him really, really, he's got to have that job because he's addicted to the alcohol. So there are all these things that are documented with addiction overall, and I think we need to now be asking the question as researchers, where does carb addiction come into this? For example, I'm interested to know there's quite a bit of documentation on historic diets of, say, Rajput kings in India, but less at least I haven't found it yet. I'd be interested to know, what are the diets of the working classes at that time, 200 years ago, 300 years ago? And can we find elements of sort of this carb addiction playing a role? I don't know. It's an open question.
Mm. Okay, you mentioned, Samir, that the companies use ultra-processed foods like pizza and workplace incentives. How does this compare to historical tactics and examples of the same, such as using alcohol to control, labor forces? You just spoke about it. So can you just elaborate a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, these are questions that need to be asked. I can tell you myself, so I was involved, I was working for an organization called Amnesty International, and one of the offices I was working at, we were doing some labor organizing at that time. And, by law, you couldn't discuss the labor union. We were trying to form a labor union because we weren't happy with our treatment, right? So as workers. And by law, you can't discuss that during the working hours, right? So from 9 to 5, you cannot discuss it. Now, what the bosses would do is they would find out what day we were having the meeting. It wasn't hidden. Someone obviously knew, someone often told them, and they would bring in pizzas at 3, 4 o'clock before the end of the office hours. Now, I'll tell you, trying to have a rational discussion with people on an empty stomach versus just after they've consumed whatever it is, 500 grams of pizza, it's a very different thing. It's just much more difficult to do that organizing. So there's people that want to get home and sleep. People just are not, they forget exactly what their complaints were earlier in the day, or they're not as good as articulating them, right? So for me, my lived experience is that was just a very weird thing. And of course, there's an element of just bribery in there too, that the bosses are giving you something. So here, we're giving you free pizza. Please don't ask for, 500 rupees more per hour or something like that. Please don't do that, right? So there's the sort of bribery element, but the fact that it's pizza, which again is like the top of all these food addiction lists, it's just raising my eyebrows a little bit. That why is this particular food associated with these union busting efforts? I
Mm.
think it may be something to do with an addictive component of it.
Mm. Okay. You suggest that revising food subsidy policies could be more effective than imposing a sugar tax. What specific policy changes do you believe can do that, reduce the carb addiction?
Yeah, so here we have to really ask what's going on. So I mentioned earlier that the carbs are cheap, and historically that's always been the case. But at the current moment, we can talk about this in the Indian case. At the current moment, they're super cheap, right? So there's an interview on my channel if people want to go check it out with a doctor called Veena Shatrugna, who was with the FICCI, the Food Corporation of India, for many, 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 many years. I forget how many years, but it basically was a long, long and healthy career that she had. And she described how these food policies came in, the subsidy policies came in to subsidize certain products that were seen as, and basically we're talking about grains. It was about rice, wheat, and lentils. That's pretty much it. So dal, rice, and wheat. And those were brought in, the people who brought them in, she said in that interview, they had a certain ideological bent. They were Brahmins from Tamil Nadu almost exclusively, right? So they had a certain ideological bent that was good, but those foods had to be kept cheap. Now, what other foods get subsidized in India? Sugar is one of them.
Sugar,
Now,
yes.
if we're talking about internationally, corn in the US is probably one of the most subsidized crops like you can possibly imagine, right? And that corn is so subsidized that it's cheaper, although the process for making high fructose corn syrup is a very complicated process. It's a 12-step process. It's not easy, but it is more, it is better for the farmers to create corn that they know they can sell for some pittance, for a very small amount, that will then get turned into basically a sugar substitute, than to grow healthy vegetables or animals, whatever foods you would like to grow there, right? So we have globally, this is not just a US thing, it's not just an India thing. Globally, we have inherited subsidy schemes from a time of scarcity. And maybe in some contexts, those subsidy schemes still make some sense, but I would argue in almost all the contexts, they now need to be phased out. And we need to be asking different questions around what is the most nutritious way to feed our populations? How can we avoid these deficiencies that have become so common in India that I know Dr. Ankur was just talking to you guys about as well. So if we have different aims for subsidy, I'm not saying get rid of subsidies altogether, but the subsidies shouldn't be making dangerous food and addictive food artificially cheap.
Hmm. Samir, tell us, how is addiction, or how does addiction to processed foods actually benefit corporations and governments? Because you've raised a very pertinent question of, food addiction is essential, whether it is essential or not, in maintaining the current economic structure. So elaborate a bit on this.
I think there's two questions here. So one is, and the one that other people will have talked about in this conference in a lot of detail, maybe more detail than we have time for here, are the direct beneficiaries of this system, right? So we're talking about food companies. So for example, in the example I've just given of high fructose corn syrup, it's the Coca-Cola, which is using that high fructose corn syrup, which is artificially cheap. It is whatever companies are producing the high fructose corn syrup. I don't even know the names of those companies, but probably Monsanto, Unilever. That's a traditional 4 or 5 big food companies that do all this stuff, right? So that's the traditional food companies on the one end. And then on the back end, so people are getting sick. Now, this may sound conspiratorial, but it's just how the system works. On the back end, if I have diabetes, now suddenly I need metformin and I need Ozempic and I need insulin. I need to inject insulin twice a day. So someone is making money off of those medicines as well. So those are what I would call the direct beneficiaries of the system. Then there's the indirect beneficiaries. And this gets a little bit more controversial. Because in a system, globally, we know that inequality is off the scale. In countries like India and South Africa, our inequality indices are just crazy. So the difference between the haves and the have-nots, it just creates a constant tension, right? Because the gap is so wide. So the question, when you have such we know from different studies that when you feel less privileged than your neighbor, and by the way, it's not just the very poor who feel less privileged. All of us, the way the capitalist system sort of works, all of us are comparing ourselves to people who are more. I may make, a crore a year, but I'm comparing myself to someone who makes 10 crore a year, whatever it is, right? So that's the way our media is structured. That's the way our minds are structured, right? So when you are under that kind of stress, you need different coping mechanisms. And addiction is a very popular, and I would say almost a universal coping mechanism. I mean, I've done a lot of work with clients and seen, especially young people, teenagers, how they cope. Some kind of addictive behavior, doesn't have to be food, doesn't have to be drugs, can be other kinds of behaviors. It's almost universal in our society at this point in time. So again, to give you the US example, I come from the US, although I used to live in India too, so I know both pretty well. 25% of the US public are either unemployed or underemployed, right? Underemployed means basically you're one paycheck away from a disaster. If you get laid off tomorrow, maybe you have 2 weeks before you won't be able to pay your rent or you won't be able to make your car payments, etc. So in that kind of extremely stressful situation, what do we expect? We expect people to turn to addiction. And also when you talk to people about their lives and you see how they're coping, often they are very food fixated.
Yes.
They're always talking about what is for lunch, what is for dinner. You just finished breakfast, you're talking about what's for lunch. Relax, man. Let's do something else. Let's go out, have some fun, do something else, right? So when people are so food fixated, it does make me ask the question, is that their addiction? Is that what's going on here?
Yeah, I think it totally makes sense. I mean, it makes me also ask, in such a scenario, and you often see that in India as well, the moment you finish your, breakfast, the discussion around lunch starts, and before that, even ends the discussion around, what should be nashta, and, all of that starts. So yes, totally agree with you there, Sameer. You've suggested that revising food policies could be more effective than imposing a sugar tax. What specific policy changes do you believe would help reduce carb addiction? And the second part of the question also, because you're speaking, giving us a lot of extempore, so I don't want to disturb you there. Critics also argue that sugar taxes disproportionately impact low-income populations. How do you respond to this concern?
Yeah, so again, I think we have to ask some very basic questions here. So if we accept that the food models we have, so let's use India as an example, the food model we have was in the context of our early independence phase. It was built during the Nehruvian period when, I don't know the statistics, but let's say 1 out of 4 Indians were in danger of starvation, right? Now, the total number of people in food insecurity is actually, it's more or less the same, or it's gone up a little bit because the population has increased so much. So the policies have worked on some level but they haven't worked on others, right? So I think it's time to revise those. And this is getting back to some of the things that Dr. Veena Shatrugna said. It's time to revise those and say, look, how can we actually put our emphasis on things that will actually feed the public. Now, I don't have all the answers here. I can't, India is a country of 1.3, 1.4 billion people. I can't give answers for everyone, right? But I think asking questions of how to localize the food supply, asking questions of how to actually prioritize the important nutrient-dense, protein-rich foods, right? Which were done in the past too. And I think maybe learning from the history and how it was done in the past, that's important. I think things like backyard chickens, when I've traveled all over South Asia, and when I'm in a country like Nepal, which was my trips to Nepal are already a decade old, so maybe people today have a different experience. But the fact that everyone from the very rich to the very poor had backyard chickens and we're sort of using that in the cities, but also in the countrysides. And we're relying on those chickens as a source of protein. We're relying on the eggs as a source of protein, and also sometimes killing the chickens and eating the meat and so on. That gave them a kind of independence from the markets, from the food supply. And so if the price of eggs went up in the US, all of my friends are complaining that the eggs are expensive. Well, if we had more localized food supplies, you wouldn't be dependent on those nationally set or national egg prices, right? You'd be able to get it yourself, right? Also, I mean, things like dairy has been very vilified, I think, for reasons that just not necessarily true. And so I think when we're talking about an animal like a goat in the South Asian context can be so important and can be kept in urban, peri-urban, rural areas and so on, and can provide, at least some basic protein level for the entire family, right? So, of course, as low-carb people, maybe we don't like milk, maybe you turn it into paneer, whatever you want to do. I mean, that's a sort of secondary question. But how to ensure that we're actually hitting our protein targets, hitting our nutrient targets. In the context of India, that's a very, very challenging question. And we need to think outside of the orthodoxy. We need to find new ways of thinking about that question.
And the second part of my question was, critics argue that sugar taxes proportionately impact low-carb, low-income populations. How do you respond to this concern?
I mean, it's just like saying cigarette taxes disproportionately affect low-income populations. It's true, because they're addicted to it, right? I mean, that's one of their coping mechanisms. So just because you have, I mean, let's make it even more dramatic. In countries that have, you could say other kinds of addiction, bhang, heroin, these kind of things in India are much more common in the working classes and the very poor than in the elites, right? So does that mean that we shouldn't tax those things, or we shouldn't try and make those things illegal? Like, what are we saying here? You have deep problems, and your problem is being covered up. It's a kind of Band-Aid solution, is this sugar addiction. So what I'm saying is you need to address, if you want to address the health of the population as a whole, you have to address those deeper problems. And again, there's no easy answer here, but I think, again, trying to help people organize, trying to give people community support, that's going to be a big part of getting over any sugar addiction and other kinds of addictions too, right? And the other thing that we're saying is, sometimes people imagine that we're going to change the price of a Coca-Cola from 2 rupees to 2,000 rupees overnight. Like that's never done. That's not how policy works, right? We make things gradually more expensive over time, so that people can wean themselves off the addiction. I mean, that happened to me. I used to be a smoker, and the price of cigarettes, I can remember, went up from, I'm talking about in Canada in the 1990s, the price of cigarettes went up from about $3, $4 a packet to about $8 a packet. So I just started smoking half as much because I couldn't afford to smoke what I used to smoke, right? So those are the kind of things that addicts will do. They'll have to wean themselves off it, and it's actually a good thing, right? It's not a bad thing.
Sameer, for those who are struggling with carb addiction, what are some of the practical tips or advice, would you want to give to them so that they can kind of, explore that option or try and break free from that cycle?
Yeah, this is a tough one, because there really is no one-size-fits-all solution. I think the first thing to do, and that most people can't do, and if you take this first step, you are so far ahead of everyone else, is just to recognize that you have a problem. So if you think, geez, I'm eating chocolate every day, and do I have a chocolate addiction? Just keep the chocolate out of your house for a week and see what happens. That will tell you for sure if you have an addiction, right? And if you recognize that you have that addiction, then you have different options. So different people would like to, some people recommend to phase out gradually. That's fine. If it works, that's totally fine. Instead of 2 pieces of chocolate, have 1 piece of chocolate. I don't know. I mean, that's possible. That's great. Other people will say, no, you have to quit cold turkey. Great. If that works for you, absolutely great. I quit smoking cold turkey 20 years ago or whatever. Fine. Great. No problem. What I found personally is two strategies helped me. So this is, I'm just sharing my own
Yes.
evidence, please take it with a grain of salt, but this is what worked for me. The first thing is fasting, because for me, it was always, even to this day, it is easier for me not to eat at all than to avoid the things that's triggering me. Once I've eaten, I'm going to want the carbs. So it's just better for me not to eat the whole day and maybe have a proper nutrient-dense dinner that will fill me up and then not eat anything again till the whole day. That worked better for me than trying to control my cravings. And the second thing that works for me is I suspect, I don't have all the evidence to back this up, but I suspect that a lot of our cravings have to do with the fact that we're not eating enough nutrient-dense foods. So when I'm having these cravings, I'm going to have my 5 eggs in a smoothie with some heavy cream, 5, 6, maybe even 10 eggs if I'm feeling really bad or like I really need something. Because those egg yolks especially give me all the micronutrients that I could possibly need. And I find it's much easier to resist the cravings after having those nutrient-dense foods. Of course, I'm also having my steak and my lamb and my mutton as well. So I'm having those nutrient-dense foods, and then I find it a lot easier to resist those cravings.
Samir, in your opinion, is there some tool besides what we heard from Dr. Jen Anwen yesterday? Is there some tool or some steps or a guidebook kind of a thing that you would want to recommend for those who are struggling with carb addiction?
Not really. I think there are lots of resources, and Dr. Jen would know better than me, so I'll defer to her. But I think the idea of community support, all of those tools include, and even if we look at traditional addiction, the idea of having some community support, the idea of being open about these things. Sometimes we're embarrassed to say to our friends and our family, look, I'm struggling. Please don't offer me the mithai 500 times because it's a struggle for me to say no, right? So I think being a little bit open and trying to have those discussions with our friends and family and trying to find some people who actually do it with us. It's a good thing when you go to the, if you decide to go to the gym tomorrow for the first time, it's great to go with someone who will keep you accountable. How many days a week do you want to go to the gym? And can you come with me? We can go together, right? In the same way, is there someone who, if you're quitting, I don't know, if you're quitting mithai, is there someone who you can quit with? Is there someone who's willing to take that step with you? I'm sure you'll find. If you ask your friends around, someone want to do this, we can hold each other accountable. You're going to have much better results.
Yeah, and I also think, Samir, there's also this in-your-face media angle and, commercialization of, the food, and it's available everywhere, right from a hospital to the airport to schools, and, you just can't avoid it. I think that also plays a major trigger as far as community is concerned, the way we live now. I mean, community where we can physically go and interact may not be possible, but yes, online communities that can give you support. But at the end of the day, we are still living in the real world with all these triggers around us. So I think that may be a bit challenging, but as Samir said, there are a lot of resources that one can use. And as Dr. Jen Anwin was also, mentioning of all these things, CRAVED, if you think, you're getting withdrawal symptoms and, it is, that it is impacting you and your life in a very negative way, and yet you cannot stop. I think these are some of the very evident symptoms of carb addiction, and probably you can check out these resources that Samir has mentioned and other speakers have mentioned. Okay, Samir, coming back to the questions, conventional addiction treatment often focuses on the substance itself, yet your research suggests the environment plays a bigger role, which I was just wanting to come over to. How should addiction treatment evolve in the light of this understanding?
Again, I think that so there's two levels here. Just when I work with clients, there are two things we do. One is, and I think Dr. Rob Saiba has talked about this a little bit. It's almost like trading addictions. He wouldn't use this language, but that's the language I use. So if you have a cigarette addiction, for example, if you trade that cigarette addiction for a carb addiction, that's probably a positive thing. It's not great. It has its own issues, but you've probably taken a step up in terms of your own health and so on. When I first got into this world in 2017, 2018, I actively cultivated a coffee addiction.
Okay.
So, it was like I'm really, really trying to get myself focused on coffee because my addiction to black coffee is how I got over my addiction to chocolate and other carbs, right? So I think there's something about understanding that these things do play a role in our life and you have to sort of use that. Now, what Dr. Saibas talks about and what I agree with is that actually that has to get to the emotion management. Why do you need those things? And that's a deeper conversation that has to do with triggers, that has to do with childhood trauma. And in my academic work, I argue that childhood trauma is pretty much universal in our current
Correct.
system.
Yes.
But that it's unique to our capitalist, to our modern system, because the communities that I interviewed who can remember a time before there were any white folks in this area, they didn't experience that trauma in the same way, right? So I'm arguing that it's something unique to our particular post-colonial system, but it is almost universal within this, right? Anyhow, that's a different discussion. But eventually we have to focus on healing those childhood wounds, healing the trauma and so on. And that's the only way we ultimately get over. It's one thing to have an addiction. It's a second thing to have an addictive personality which is prone to addiction. And we can get over a particular addiction, no problem. But getting over the addictive personality piece of it, that's hard, and that takes emotional work. That takes, psychotherapy, other things. Basically, we have to understand ourselves and be willing to forgive ourselves and maybe other people in our lives. So that's a much longer discussion.
Yeah.
But it's a very important discussion. I would encourage people in India to start thinking along those lines, because of course there's so many taboos around this psychoanalysis and so on in India as well. So it's something we need to begin to wrestle with more.
Now, I think we do need to change the entire narrative, Samir, because we have kind of glorified addiction. We've kind of normalized addiction. We have kind of normalized obesity as well. I'm very, very interested in knowing, Samir, in your practice, what are one or two of the worst cases of addiction that you've seen, and how did you help them out?
Yeah, it's so there was an interesting case. Listen, my again, I don't want people to over extrapolate from these anecdotes, because everyone's different. I had to treat this person in a particular way. But there's a case of a person who came to me because his wife basically twisted his arm. His wife had worked with me and had lost some weight, and this guy really, really, really didn't want to work with me. But his wife was paying for it, and well, he forced him. So he said, "Look, Samir, I'm happy to work with you as your health coach. I believe you know what you're doing. I've read your book, et cetera, et cetera. Fine. But you have to know something about me that is not negotiable. That is that my diet consists of pizza and beer." So I was like, okay, your diet consists of pizza and beer. Okay. So I said, fine, I can work with that parameter. However, if you start making some progress, if you listen to my advice and you make some progress, then we're going to revisit this pizza and beer thing in the future. Just keep an open mind around it. That's what I said. He said, fine. I said, okay, we're going to do it. This was someone who had maybe 40 kilos to lose, I would say. Okay. He's a big guy. I said, look, what we're going to do is how do you feel about fasting? Can you skip a meal? He said, yeah, I can skip a meal, no problem. I said, fine. What we're going to do, you're going to skip lunch. You're going to skip breakfast. For dinner, you have as much pizza and beer as you want, however, within a 1 hour window. I want you to finish eating by 7 p.m. Between 6 and 7 p.m., you have as much pizza and beer as you want. I don't care, right? Now, what happened after a couple of weeks, he was able to do that. The first day, by the way, was torture because he is so addicted to the sugar and everything. But after a day or two, he got used to this pattern and he lost 6-7 kilos in about 2 weeks, okay? Which is to be expected when you start intermittent fasting, right? And then what happens is he comes back and not only has the weight loss happened, but he used to suffer pains, sort of arthritic. We don't know if it was arthritis or gout. He never got tested, but really bad pains in his joints and so on. When those started to go away, then he was like, well, actually it wasn't completely gone, but the joint pain is much better. And also used to have a lot of trouble getting out of bed in the morning. You can imagine someone who's eating pizza and beer, he was able to get out more and more. So he himself started noticing these positive things. And once that started, I said, okay, can we downgrade? Tell me other foods you like besides pizza and beer, right? And that began a conversation whereby eventually we got him, he's not carnivore, but we got him to a much lower carb way of eating, much healthier. I think he's now running marathons and stuff. So it was the beginning of his journey, a reluctant journey. But once he started to see improvements, people are stuck in their own narrative. They think, yeah, ye hamara kismat hai, hum kuch nahi ho gaya. That's what they start to think. There's a fate. But once they start to see that they can change their fate, then suddenly, the possibilities open up and suddenly they can live much, much better and much healthier lives.
Samir, have you seen, withdrawal symptoms, so to say, and what are those? I mean, if you've taken up clients who have carb addiction, talk a bit about the withdrawal symptoms so people can also identify, what happens.
Yeah. I mean, I think what happens is, again, fixation on that thing. Because often people, if you quit cold turkey, I think this is probably less of a problem. But if you are trying to do it slowly, people just fixate on that food the whole day until they allow themselves it. That's a weird problem to have. And it's weird even for me as a coach, it's weird to advise how to help. Because again, it's like, the physical addiction, it's the same with cigarettes. After a week of not smoking, your physical addiction to cigarettes is over. But the desire to sort of go to a cafe and pick up a cigarette is so strong that you can be talking to people years afterwards and they still have that desire. So it's like, how do we get over that piece? It's not easy. So it's that the hard mental work that people are reluctant to do. And even I, as a coach, I'm reluctant to get them to start there because it is difficult. That is sort of the main side effect. And I think one of the things that really helps with this era is, can we use physical exercise? Can we use exercise? I don't care what kind of exercise, but can we use some kind of physical activity as a way to get some of those emotions out, whatever it is? Because that seems to help a lot. That really, even for myself, trying to think back when I had these problems, if on days when I went to the gym, people think that you're more hungry and that you're going to eat more and that you're going to give into the carbs. It's actually the opposite, I found. On days when I'd actually done a workout and my body was feeling good, I was much more able to resist. My willpower was much stronger. And there's all kinds of studies done on the mental health benefits of exercise. So although, again, it's counterintuitive and people will think, no, I've exercised, so I need to eat more. I don't think it's the case. I think when you're getting some of these emotions out physically, you're more able to deal with them and less able to be less likely to be tempted by lack of willpower.
Mm. Samir, do you think there's any difference between what people usually refer to as emotional eating and addiction?
These things are all nuances, aren't they? And I think
Yeah, they are.
I think they're definitely connected.
Mm.
But I think there is a difference. I mean, so when I think about emotional eaters, right? Of course, that can draw the line into you can sort of step over into addiction at any point in time. But when you think about emotional eating, you think about someone who's had a breakup, or maybe a bereavement, or maybe they lost a job or something, and it's a temporary, it's a time-bound thing that they are overeating for a certain period of time. But if you find that time-bound thing, so let's say, you had a bereavement, you lost a partner, you lost a spouse, you lost a father, you lost a mother, whatever it may be, and you are overeating for a period of time. If that happens for a week, okay. If that happens for 2 weeks, that's good. If that happens for a month, okay, what's going on here? If that happens for 3 months, you probably cross the line into something else. This is no longer just, or maybe you need to, maybe you need to see a therapist about what may be going on otherwise. Maybe you've crossed the line from what would be a normal, healthy response to a bereavement. Maybe now you've gone into an extended depression, and this is a symptom of that.
Mm. Before we come to the end of this, and I have a question to ask ask of you about your blog. But before that, Samir, how do you see this entire narrative that we have in the society of, normalizing addiction or normalizing obesity? For example, you have plus size clothes and
Yeah,
words like fat shaming, that make you feel guilty for, being rather kind of telling somebody that, look, you are at the risk of metabolic syndromes, or you're not fine and you should take care of it. So it's in a very good spirit, but it's taken wrongly, and that I think has been promoted by companies who are probably wanting to sell more food, more clothes. And
100%.
what is your take on this? I mean, how can we get out of this trap? Because every day that we get up, there's some messaging out there that tells you obesity is normal, and plus size clothes are normal, eating pizza is joy, coke is happiness, and all of this.
So I think there's two things here. So I am so my background, my training is very much in the feminist movement. My first degrees are in women's studies, in women's rights theory, etc. And so in that we learn that the personal is political, but it's also the case that the political is personal. Like it's a
Yeah.
two-way street, right?
Mm.
And so I think there's a difference between blaming the individual and sort of being mean. So I grew up in a very cutthroat all boys school where we were always verbally abusing each other pretty badly. It was a pretty rough way to grow up, right? And I, as sort of the fat kid, I mean, I got a lot of bullying as a result of that, right? And that's not good. It's not about the individual, but there are societal pressures that are making us all a certain way. And so I think when we start to say that, and we start to talk to the individual who may have a problem, for example, in one of my conferences the other day, I got all the men to stand up and I said, just look down. And if you see a belly, then you have visceral fat and we need to talk about that. Now, some people didn't. I think the way I did it, people were comfortable because I was like, this is a societal problem. And we all, people don't know that if you have a belly, it's a sign of visceral fat, right? But it could have been done in another way. It could have been done in a very bullying kind of way. So I think a lot of this is like nuance. It's like, we're not here to blame anyone, but we want to inform people that if this is your phenotype, if this is what you look like, it is very likely that you are suffering from metabolic syndrome. And if you have metabolic syndrome, your chance of heart disease goes up 1,000%. Your chance of Alzheimer's goes up 1,000%. Your chance of cancer goes up, perhaps even more than that. I haven't looked at the statistics, et cetera, right? So people don't know that, and they have a right to know that. And people don't know that if you just, here in South Africa, the standard diet is something called meat and pap. Pap is basically just corn, millets porridge. Traditionally it was millets, today it's corn. And I said, look, if you just take that out, because it's a traditional diet, I'm not saying don't eat your traditional diet. Just take out the carbohydrate component of it. You're going to be so much better. And lots of people are like, oh, I only ate that because it was a vegetable and I thought I have to eat my vegetables, right? So just to give this information and let people make their own decisions. If someone says, I want to eat 2 liters of Coca-Cola a day, hey, I'm not here to stop you, man. It's your life. But I want you to know that there are consequences for that. And I want you to understand that, if you have a wife or a husband, if you have children, if you have family who depend on you, those consequences aren't just about you, right? It's about your whole social network, and you have to be responsible for that. Well, these are some of the things that I want people to be asking themselves. I don't want people to be blaming themselves. It's not about blame. It's about how can we actually get better.
Yeah. Samir, how can people check out your blogs and kindly, tell us the inspiration behind writing those blogs. And in the meanwhile, I would ask Shashi and Anup also to come on the screen. Yes, Samir.
Yeah, sure. So all of my stuff is at samirdossani.net. So just my full name .net. You can check out all my stuff there. Listen, in terms of my inspiration, going back to when I first started this, I came to the revelation. So I'd spent 20 years trying to sort of improve the world, change the world. I'd worked with various governments as well, trying to, make pro-poor policies, et cetera. But I came to the conclusion after 20 years of doing this work that I was banging my head against the wall, and that actually there are structures which make us who we are. There are structures which perpetuate injustice at every level. And that thinking led me to think that those same structures are what perpetuates the food environment that we see, and also the fact that we see so much chronic disease. So that was really the motivation for writing my first book, which is The Health Dialectic. That was my motivation, that it's not, again, getting back to this issue of personal responsibility. Yes, there's personal responsibility, but to some extent, we're all victims of a system that is pushing us in a certain direction. And hats off to people like Anup, who have been able to swim upstream in very difficult circumstances in India. I lived in India for 10 years. I know how difficult it is, what you guys have done. So hats off to you guys for this amazing conference and for everything that you've done. But it's about understanding that the current is flowing a certain way, and understanding what makes the current flow that certain way. And then to give people the knowledge and the information and hopefully the power that they need to swim against that current.
Yeah. Anup and Shashi.
Yeah, thank you, Samir. Thank you. Before I hand it over to Shashi, I would like to ask a light-hearted question. Was pizza ever tried to be declared a vegetable?
I think, in some of you ask it in a joking way, but if you look at some of those nurses' health study surveys and so on, which I've written about and others have written about, pizza and lasagna were classified as vegetables, pizza and lasagna were classified as meats. Sorry. So that's, when you see these things that meat correlates with higher cancer, et cetera, just keep in mind that pizza was classified as a meat in some of those epidemiological surveys.
Nice.
Thank you, Samir, for sharing this platform and sharing your insights on carb addiction as a tool to control. And I'm sure that we'll have our collaborations on for quite a long time.
No, thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure, guys.
Thank you so much for